feel like every single producer should at least once try to make some soulful vintage samples. Now, whether it's because you got tired of making the same samples, you don't want to be making, just dark basic samples, you just want to step up your game, soulful samples aren't as hard to make as you might think. You just gotta consider a couple of things, which some of them are common sense, but they tend to go over a lot of people's heads. And in today's video specifically, I'm gonna be sharing all the sauce when it comes to this stuff. So make sure to watch until the end, and without too much talk, let's just get into the video. The first and foremost thing, whenever you want to make these type of samples, you gotta use only live instruments. Pianos, violins, guitars, bass guitars, Rhodes, just anything which is an actual live instrument. And preferably you want to use high quality VST banks, or even better, actual live instruments if you know how to play them. But in this case, since most people don't know how to play instruments, I'm gonna be showing you everything by just using plugins. Starting off with the first sound, I picked a piano as the bass sound for the sample, and I'm using addictive keys with the dry bite preset, and I lay down this pattern. I added the root notes down here, so I established the chord progression. Basically we have a 6, 5, 1, and up here I just built the chords corresponding to these root notes. Starting off we have a G major chord, a G major 7 chord, so basically a simple triad with an added 7th. So I just grabbed the slice tool and I just came here and I just messed around with the different notes. After that I just walked the melody up. So basically I just added this note and this note, so it progresses up. Then we have the 5 chord, which is an F sharp minor chord, and basically it's just a minor 7 chord. So basically we just have the 7th chord here, and I took the 3rd and I pitched it up an octave. Again, I used the slice tool and I'm just chopping up a couple of notes just to create a little melody inside the chords. And finally, to resolve the whole chord progression, we have the 1 chord, which is a B minor chord. Since I wanted to spice it up a little bit and not just whoop these 3 chords over and over again, I kind of progressed the whole chord progression. So what I did was I just took these chords and I pasted them right here in the next 4 bars. On the first chord I took the 3rd and I pitched it up an octave. After that, for the 2nd chord, I took the 3rd once again and I pitched it up an octave. And here for the final chord, what I did was basically I just took the root note and the 3rd and I pitched them up an octave. So from this it went to this, and it just kind of creates this variation in the second part. After that, what I did was I just selected the entire pattern and I hit Alt and S, and then I just strummed every single chord. And as you can see, this is the whole base of the sample, and it's just 3 simple chords. When it comes to the processing, one major thing which a lot of people overlook whenever they try to make these vintage soulful samples is you want to be using time accurate effects. What I mean by that is you just want to be using stuff which they had access to in the 60s and the 70s, not something which is, from 2020. Back then they did not have any digital reverbs, any digital delays, parametric EQs, and all that stuff. Starting off with the first EQ, I'm using this Waves Shep 73, and what I'm doing here is I'm taking out the low end and I'm boosting the high end. And right after that I have this analog chorus from Arturia. Moving on to the next layer, I wanted to layer with some strings, so I picked a couple of violins. To start off with the first one, I'm using Chris Hine, and I'm using this violin 2 small preset out of the Chris Hine Ensemble Strings Contact Bank, and I lay down this pattern. Now this melody is extremely simple. If you go inside the piano and I just paste it over the top line melody, all I'm doing is basically I'm starting on the root note and then I'm pretty much just doing the exact same thing which I did with the chords, just with a little delay. And I'm using the articulations of the preset, which basically, just slides the notes up and down, especially around this part. I added even more strings, so I layered it with this viola, which is basically a violin, but it's a little bit bigger. And once again, I'm using the exact same contact bank, and this layer is playing these notes. So the way I came up with this layer on its own, it doesn't really make sense whenever you play it back, but I was just playing the previous two layers and, you know, just listening back and playing on my keyboard until I came up with this. So whenever you play it with other instruments, it sounds like this. On both these layers, I'm applying the exact same vintage chorus. So the whole idea behind this is, back in the days whenever they were processing stuff, they would usually just, you know, add a chorus, add a flanger, like any effect, and that would be on an actual rack of effects. So they weren't really like messing around, you know, adjusting every single time they add a new layer. They were pretty much just using the exact same preset, if you want to call it that, on every single layer. And after adding the chorus, I took these 3 layers and I routed them to a mix bus, and there I applied this Valhalla vintage reverb. And once again, basically I'm just emulating how they would record in one single room, and it will have the exact same reverb. Now, another thing when it comes to these vintage samples, if you want to add time accurate reverbs, you gotta consider that they only had access to plate reverbs and spring reverbs. There were no digital reverbs, there were no hall reverbs. It was just plate reverbs and spring reverbs. Now, moving on to the next layer, I wanted to add some little vocals in the background, because when it comes to these samples, you can add a lot of vocals. Like, for example, you can have a whole choir singing, you can have a singer, you can have background vocals. But in this case, I wanted something which is gonna layer together with the violins. So I open up Contact, and once again, I'm using this Voice of Rapture, the soprano bank. And when you play it back with other violin layers, it sounds like this. So it just kind of harmonizes with the rest of the layers. And when it comes to the delay, I have this very short delay just to widen the vocal a little bit more. And then once again, I have a Valhalla vintage reverb, and I'm using a smooth plate reverb. And now for the final melodic layer, I added this bass guitar. Bass lines are very important in these type of samples. So I'm using this Carby Rickenbacker bass, and the way I came up with this bass line, I actually played it on my guitar first, so it sounds like this. But after I pitched it down an octave, it just didn't sound deep enough, and, you know, it didn't sound like an actual live bass guitar. So I just used the Contact bank and I laid down the exact same pattern. So all I'm doing here is I'm just following the root notes of the chord progression, and in between I'm adding these little phrases which, you know, just spice up the whole bass line. As far as the processing on the bass guitar, I just have Guitar Rig 6 and I'm using a simple preamp. And now before we move on to the more texture parts of the sample, I want to show you the most important part, which is going to be the melody master bus. So without any processing, the melody sounds like this. But what they did back in the day, everything was recorded on tapes, so everything had a little bit more saturation, it was a little bit more degraded, it wasn't the highest quality. And to make it as realistic as possible, I added a couple of effects. First we have this V76 preamp, right after that we have the COA2A, which is another vintage analog compressor. Here what I'm doing is I'm cutting off everything under 50 Hz, so, you know, just taking out that part of the low end. And I'm also just reducing all the peaks. And for the final effect, of course, we got tape saturation. And here I'm just using the Kramer tape stereo, and I have this mastering crunchy preset, which basically is just turning up the flux and, you know, just degrading the sample and making it more saturated and more vintage. And finally, for the minor details, because if you skip those, the sample is just not gonna sound as vintage. So I added a couple of textures. The first one is this jazz brush texture. Basically just providing a little bit of rhythm in the background. Right after that, I have this vinyl crackle texture because all of these records were pressed in vinyls, so you know, it just came with the sound. And finally, I have this white noise texture, so all these textures together sound like this. And what I did after that was basically I just took the whole sample, I exported it, and I pitched it up 3 semitones, and I sped it up a little bit.